Alright, westward expansion, transcontinental railroad. Your second video out of 3 for westward expansion. Transcontinental railroad, you have the questions at the top that you need to be responsible for. I think there's only one. And then for your notes this time, it's just a little bit more broad. You need to choose what to write down. Remember, there will be some sort of a assessment or quiz in addition to your homework grade. So what we are looking at is the Transcontinental Railroad, which is the first railroad system to connect the East Coast and the West Coast, built between 1863 and 1869 with government money. So if you think about that, that's during the Civil War and right after the Civil War, and they're spending government money to be able to do this. So it was a little bit of a project. It was authorized by 2 different railroad acts, the Pacific Railroad Act of 1862 and 1864, which, think about the time period, that would have been under President Lincoln, so this was one of his projects. This was part of how he saw the country expanding and growing and uniting after the Civil War. So just because they had the Civil War doesn't mean they put off development projects for the country. They just kind of dealt with 2 things at once. So, and we talked about before in class why it's one of the most important events of the 1800s. So what we see is we see 2 main railroad companies, the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific, and what you need to be able to do is identify which one from each direction. So Central from the west, Union from the east, and they each have their own set of problems. The Central Pacific starts in California, and they deal with mountain ranges, labor shortages, and weather. So building a railroad through a bunch of mountains is not easy. So if you think about what that would entail, and on top of that, there wasn't that many people in California yet, or if you were in California, you were looking for gold or something else, so they couldn't find enough people to work, and they have to deal with the cold weather and the snow in the mountains. And so they generally did mostly terrain issues. The Union Pacific was going through the east and through the Great Plains mostly, and their biggest issue were the Native Americans, who decided that they didn't like them. We talked about the Native Americans not minding the settlers going through, but the railroad divided the Great Plains, and the Sioux and Cheyenne in particular fought to stop that from happening. So, solutions to their problems. Immigrant labor was a big one. So they needed people that were willing to work in dangerous conditions, people that were willing to work for low amounts of money. And in the West, they find the Chinese. And the Chinese specifically are treated almost like slaves, one step above. And we're going to look at a couple of political cartoons dealing with the Chinese in class. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then the Irish from the East. One of the solutions in the West was to blast through the mountains. So nitroglycerin was the solution to that. So instead of digging through the mountains, digging through the rock, which is how they started at first, they decided to blow things up, and that was much, much faster. They also built tunnels through the mountains, again, using nitroglycerin, and trusses over the valleys. So instead of going up and down through the trains, they tried to go as straight as possible. And we'll show you some pictures of those in class. In the East, their solution with the Native Americans is to kill the buffalo. We talked and watched the video in class about how dependent the Native Americans were on the buffalo. So get rid of the buffalo or move the buffalo, it makes it harder for the Native Americans to survive. They also increased security along the tracks using federal troops, and they would have some of the native tribes fight against the others. So they would have Native American scouts that would work with them to attack the enemy tribes. So business model, we'll talk more about this in class, but basically they wanted to make money by any means necessary, legal, illegal, they didn't care. So during the Civil War, some of the railroad guys in the East made tons of money selling illegal cotton. Cotton was not supposed to be sold because that's how the Southerners made money, and the North didn't want them to have money. So Thomas Durant in particular makes a bunch of money doing that. And because of their sort of by any means necessary, bribery and fraud were common with the railroads. So we see things like the credit mobilier scandal, which kind of links Congress and the railroad together. People were taking bribes and kickbacks, and we see some of that later again with Grant's administration, the idea of bribes and kickbacks, and the railroad paying to make sure that they get access to things that other people don't, or making sure that no one else can build a competing railroad in the same area. So what does a railroad do? What's your big picture question? Basically, means instead of going from east to west in 6 months, which was known as the overland route, which is what we saw the pictures of, watched the video of, with a horse and buggy, you can now do it in 7 days. 6 months to 7 days. It allows the economy to grow because goods can be shipped from the west to the east, and we'll look at some of those. But raw materials, gold, forestry products, and even crops a little bit later they're able to be shipped back and forth, and it completely changes the country because now economic development can happen in the West. The resources can be transferred back. The cattle from the Great Plains can be transferred back, and that's the biggest effect. Is it links the country and allows us to move quicker. So if you can't answer this, you might want to think about it a little bit. That's probably what I'm going to ask you to do in class. But how did the railroad help Western expansion?